are all equal under the law. Stephen says, it's easy for me to take the moral high ground. I've never had to worry about where my next meal comes from. They should be more lenient, but that doesn't mean soft. Cece says, actions have consequences. All children should be taught that from early on. Well, that's your thoughts. Keep them coming. GBviews at gbnews.com. But it's time now for the Great British Debate this hour. And I'm asking, should the courts be more lenient with those from deprived backgrounds? New sentencing guidelines have come into force this week, urging judges to consider leniency for offenders from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Sentencing Council now recommends taking into account factors like poverty, low education, discrimination, and also housing inability before passing sentence. So what do you think? For the Great British Debate this hour, I'm asking, should the courts be more lenient from those from deprived backgrounds? Well, joining me now is political commentator Stella Tsekskade. I can never say it. Stella Tsekskade.
That's okay.
Thank you, Nana. And also former Met police officer Peter Bleksley. Right, I'm going to start with Peter Bleksley because he knows all about this. Peter Bleksley, your thoughts on this?
The Sentencing Council was set up in 2010, and basically it's an old boys and old girls network for retired judges. There is a chief constable on it and a woman who has a background from looking after victims, but essentially it's judges and magistrates in a cosy little cohort issuing nonsense like these sentencing guidelines this week. And they're nonsense on a number of levels. Number one, they are deeply insulting to anybody from an impoverished background or who wasn't particularly academic, who does not break the law. Secondly, why should somebody from a middle-class background be punished more severely than somebody who perhaps comes from a working-class background? We are all supposed to be equal in the eyes of the law, and I completely agree with Anna, the GB News viewer, who sent in her opinion.
Well, Stella, what do you think?
Mitigating circumstances have always been a thing that lawyers and judges have depended on. It's not a new thing. This is just a more exhaustive list and with specific recommendations. For example, the housing circumstances of someone to be taken into consideration. But this is something that a lawyer would have, a barrister would have depended on in court anyway. And this is not something that's unique to the UK, and it's not something modern either. It's something that's always been the case. Now, the point about being more lenient based on someone's background doesn't mean that someone from a middle-class background or from an upper middle-class background would have a harder time. If anything, we all know that someone who comes from a richer background more often has an easier time when they go to court because they have more resources to defend themselves. And what about white-collar crime, of course? How so many people will not go to jail for things that we know people from a poorer background would end up being incarcerated. Now, there are other reasons as well. We can't incarcerate our way into safer communities. It is both cheaper and fairer in the short term to actually be more lenient and put people in prison less. That doesn't mean not punishing them. That just means investing more in rehabilitating them back into their community so that they can start being a member of their community again, start working and all of these things.
But listening to it, it does sound, if you're saying that it was already there before, and I'm sure the judges will take into account someone's circumstance, they always do, every case is treated as a unique case, although there is a law that people have potentially broken. But this doesn't, I mean, Peter, does this set a good precedent? Because I think you make a valid point that people from better off backgrounds, as Stella said, may have more resources, but why should they be treated differently?
Indeed, judges and magistrates have always been allowed to exert some degree of discretion when taking into account not only the offence and the offender, but the victims and the impact on them, and so on and so forth. This is frankly ludicrous that the Sentencing Council want to further handcuff judges and magistrates. We already see case upon case where sentences are way too lenient, where people are not punished sufficiently for very serious matters, and as our streets get increasingly lawless with no police patrolling them, what we actually need are deterrence. Deterrence to stop people committing crime, and if that means more prison spaces, then so be it. I'm fully in support of that.
Stella, do you not think this is more to do with the fact that the prisons are full?
And Anna, there is no evidence that incarcerating people more is going to make us safer. There's zero evidence from across the world.
Really?
The courts are not being...
No, hold on
Yes.
a minute. Are you
Yes.
sure? Listen, this is a mass murderer and he's out there. I want him incarcerated. There's absolute evidence that putting him behind bars
It sounds
will make
logical,
us
doesn't
safer.
it? It sounds logical.
Well,
It
obviously,
sounds
he's not on the
logical, doesn't
streets.
it? That you are going to lock up people and somehow we're going to be safer. But
Well, you
actually,
would
that's
be
not
if
what
he's a
happens.
murderer.
That's not the case.
Yeah, but
That's not the case, because
No,
what
it is the
actually
case.
happens is, and we're not talking about criminals who are dangerous. Obviously, they should be locked up. Nobody argues with that. This is not about that. These guidelines are not about that. And actually, I disagree with Peter. It's the courts that set the precedent. This doesn't set any precedent whatsoever. These are just guidelines that have already been existing, and that they are just writing them down. That's all this is. So the court sets the precedent, judges set the precedent, but what's going on here is they're formalizing it, because what we know is that you need to have a certain amount of rehabilitation for someone to reduce reoffending rates. You're not going to reduce reoffending rates by putting vulnerable people, young people, and entrenching them into a life of criminality, giving them a network of other criminals, especially when you know what our prisons are like right now. And if we're not going to invest in our prisons, at the very least, we need to invest in other alternative punishments that are cheaper than that.
But don't you think that young people might hear that and use that? Peter, surely people manipulate the system if they know that that's the case.
Of course they do. Criminals lie. It's what they do. And Stella espouses the typical sort of liberal left-wing claptrap, which, if she had her way, I suspect might lead to less and less people being in prison and, consequently, more and more criminals moving amongst us. There is already an epidemic of shoplifting. Violent crime is on the rise. Knife crime is at utterly unacceptable levels. And we need deterrence. We need the police to regain the streets. And sadly, they haven't done that. They've surrendered them to criminals, and in our ever increasingly criminal country, where women are so heavily impacted by harassment, crime, rape and murder, we need a firm hand, not a fluffy hand.
You need to break the feedback loop of reoffending, and you're not going to do that by putting more and more people into a completely failing prison system. And I'm not talking about violent criminals. Absolutely, violent criminals should be in prison. But there is a difference between a violent criminal and someone who sells weed.
Well, yeah, but nobody who sells weed ever goes to prison, to be honest with you, unless you've literally got a store full of it and been caught.
Well,
it's pretty hard to get arrested for that, by the way.
Failing prison system, don't we? We have completely, because of austerity measures over the last 15 years, we have completely cut everything, every single public service to the bone, and we don't have enough prisons to even put people in there, let alone rehabilitate them. So this is why you have rising crime.
Yeah, but is the answer really, Peter, to be more lenient on people who could potentially take advantage and, you know, switch on the violins and here we go?
Absolutely not. Prevention of crime is largely brought about by deterrence. Number one, the deterrent that you might be caught, and sadly that doesn't exist anywhere but as much as it should do. And secondly, the deterrent that you will be suitably punished. And once again, we are seeing the courts failing. Yes, there is a lack of prison capacity, but more prisons are online, and we need to lock up more people, not less.
Stella, final
There is no
word
evidence
to you.
for what you're saying, please.
Well,
no evidence
if you go
whatsoever.
to Qatar, you'll notice that people in Qatar don't commit crime.
By punishing the already punished, the ones who are already punished by life, further, you're not going to achieve safer community. You're just creating more bitterness, and you're creating more future criminals by giving them access to a criminal network, by destroying and destabilizing their already destabilized lives.
It's interesting you say that, because actually we had a guy on, I think it was on Farage's show, actually saying that the sentences need to be harsher, people need to be less lenient, and he's somebody who has lots of experience and has actually been stabbed in all sorts in crime.
On people who are already violent criminals, yes, but not on lower crimes. And I think this is what the guidelines are pointing to. They're not saying that someone who was murdered over and over again should be allowed
Stella,
free.
I mean, the point I was making is this, that quite seriously, that if people don't think that they're going to be seriously punished, then people are probably more likely to commit the crimes. That's just my view, but to keep your thoughts coming. Thank you very much.
What's happening right now?
Stella, I've got to go because we've got the news coming. It was really good talking to you. That's Stella. I've got it. Did I get it? I got it there, didn't I? I got it, didn't I? I think I did.
Almost.
Thank you, Stella. She's a political commentator. Also, Peter Bleksley, former Metropolitan Police detective.